Dr. Bill Richmond from the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, who's going to talk about integration, which is the main integration with Contaminated Sites and guidelines.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. Yeah, as Karina said, I'm from the Contaminated Sites branch at the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation. And the purpose of my talk today is to try and give you some idea about how this relates to our regulation of sites under the Contaminated Sites Act. But to start off with, while we're in the process of launching new guidelines, I wanted to highlight that one of our key pieces of guidance about the assessment and management of contaminated sites has just been updated. So we have a current version of the assessment and management of contaminated sites guideline that was first published in 2014, and that's been reviewed and updated as part of a 5-year review that started 2 years ago. And we're finally at the stage where that updated guideline is final and approved at the top level, and all I'm waiting for now is for the website to be updated so that we can actually get that guideline available. So I'm saying watch this space very carefully because that guideline is coming out very soon. And which leads me to showing you how this links with DOH's asbestos guidelines. So this is a section from our assessment and management guideline, and you'll see the key point here. In section 9 on soil assessment, it highlights that the primary guidance for the assessment of asbestos in soils is this DOH guideline for the assessment, remediation and management of asbestos contaminated sites in Western Australia. And that's always been the case, that this guideline is where we expect consultants to go for the best guidance on how to assess asbestos in contaminated sites and how to carry out remediation and validation processes. So our contaminated sites guidelines contain quite a range of pieces of guidance, and that list there summarises where we're at the moment with the available guidance, and you'll see that the asbestos guideline is there, number 3, and it's already on our webpage, available, linking to the Department of Health website. And section 97 of the Contaminated Sites Act provides for the CEO of our department to make guidelines for the purposes of administering the Contaminated Sites Act. And so we'll be gazetting this guideline along with our new guidelines, which is the process by which we specify these guidelines as the guidance that we can require consultants to adhere to when they carry out site assessments or remediation works. So in discussing the link between some of the asbestos removal, assessment and remediation issues we're talking about today and the Contaminated Sites Act, I guess the key point is to draw your attention to the definition of contamination under this Contaminated Sites Act. And that's shown here, that contamination in relation to land means that a substance is present in or on that land or in water associated with that land above background concentrations, and that presents or has the potential to present a risk of harm to human health, the environment, or any environmental value. So key thing about contamination here is that it's a combination of both the substance present above background concentrations and presenting a risk of harm. And that's important in considering a lot of cases where only minor amounts of asbestos containing materials might be present. You may then have a substance present above background concentrations, but the risk of harm may be the aspect that's not present in that situation. The other interesting thing about this definition is, of course, it means that naturally occurring substances can still be a source of contamination. And so there is a little section in the DOH guideline that specifically refers to naturally occurring materials, and of course we know asbestos is a naturally occurring material. And our own guideline in section 5.2 makes the same point about naturally occurring materials, in that the risk profile for those materials can be changed by disturbance or movement or a change of chemical state. So in the case of asbestos, if there may be no risk if it's present as a mineral below the surface, but when it's brought to the surface, processed in some way, turned into a finely dispersed dust, then it can be present as contamination. And of course, the best example of this is the Whitman site itself, which I think, certainly on a basis of land area, is probably our largest contaminated site in the state. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about today is this, something that often becomes an issue, and this is the uncertainty about when the presence of asbestos-containing materials as a site, particularly fragments of asbestos-containing materials, when is that a trigger for reporting the site as a contaminated site under the Act? And Chapter 2 of the DOH guideline does give some very useful guidance on this, along with Chapter 5 of the Our Department's guideline, the identification and reporting and classification of contaminated sites. So, under Section 11 of the Contaminated Sites Act, there is an obligation on owners, occupiers, polluters and contaminated sites auditors to report known or suspected contamination when they become aware of it. The question in terms of asbestos is, what does that constitute? Some examples, particularly in relation to ACM, are firstly non-trivial quantities of ACM present on the surface or in soil, and particularly if they extend below the top 10 centimetres of soil. So if they're at depth and there's some uncertainty about how much might be present on the site because it's not all visible at the surface. Another example would be where there's demolition and construction waste present and there are numerous fragments of possible asbestos-containing material. In other words, not more than just 1, 2, 4, those sorts of numbers. And the other one where there's fill imported to a site and there's evidence that that fill material contains fragments of ACM. These are considered reasons to report. You'll notice that there's no definite quantification here of what's non-trivial, and that's because, as we've said, every site's unique, and if there's a specified quantity that you have to determine in order to determine whether something's contaminated, on the one hand it may take considerable time to do that and potentially some disturbance of the site, but also you can end up with perverse outcomes that way because in the end, the issue we want people to be considering is what is the risk here? What's the actual risk of exposure for the public or for people coming on to the site? And alternately, I want to present some examples of when not to report contamination under the Act. And so again, I've reproduced a little bit of a page from our guideline here on issues that are considered aesthetic issues only. So there are some materials that are considered to present only an aesthetic concern rather than an actual health risk. And you'll see there that trivial amounts of bonded asbestos-containing material is included in that list, included there. So what that means, if the only impacts of the site are aesthetic issues, and this is the only factor or issue of concern for the site, then you don't need to report it as a suspected contaminated site. Some other examples of when not to report are situations where the asbestos on the site is present as part of an intact building or structure. So a clear example is an intact fence, an intact shed, piping, and this, I guess, relates to that last question of instances where asbestos might be present at depth, and certainly asbestos pipes, if they're intact, particularly if they're still in commission, are certainly not considered contamination. The only scenario might be if there's damage to those pipes or if they've been decommissioned and there for a long time and not in any way connected with other infrastructure at the site. But in general, intact structures are not intended to be managed under the Contaminated Sites Act. They're an issue for management under DWER's regulation. And there are certain situations for us where some of the impacts that might be present at the soil surface still don't require reporting, And we're quite happy for people to deal with these sorts of impacts before considering whether or not the site might need to be reported. So if there has been asbestos removal occurring at a site and there are still some fragments present on the soil, it's quite acceptable to clean that up as part of the removal process before considering whether there's a need to report the site. The same situation if you've got degraded structures where there might be a few fragments falling off some asbestos guttering or something like that. There are mechanisms to just clean that up as it occurs under a management plan without having to report the site. Likewise, illegal dumping is quite common for fly tipping to occur, and for the fly tip material might contain sheets of asbestos fencing or something like that. Again, that's an issue that can be dealt with in an immediate clean-up response without the need to report the site straight away. In addition to all this, there are some mechanisms for us when a site is reported under the Act to hold off on classification. So Section 14 of the Act actually specifies that our department is to classify sites within 45 days of receiving a report. But it also provides that in special circumstances we can extend the time to classify the site. And what that means is that we have the ability, when we perceive there's no immediate risk to public health in relation to a site, we can put in this process that's called stopping the clock. And we stop the clock on the classification, provided we know that there's going to be some action to deal with the issue, we can await further information. And that's very useful in times where there's no immediate risk. The site might be fenced off or something to prevent public access, and that allows proponents time to get in, do the work, do the clean-up, and then send us a report at the end without us having to go through a sequential classification process, potentially put memorials on people's certificate of title. But the piece of blue at the bottom here is the important thing. All of these things, they're site-specific, and we expect people to exercise some common sense and professional judgment in dealing with these things. And if there's any uncertainty, the best thing to do is to call our branch and talk to someone about it, because it's certainly much easier once we can talk through the site and get an idea what's going on to give people advice as to whether the site should be reported or not. Another important definition under the Act that's worth highlighting is the definition of remediation. And so there are four parts to this. Remediation is the attempted restoration of the site to its original state, or it's the restriction or prohibition of access, or it's the removal, destruction, containment or dispersal of the substance. So that applies to substances where you might do some treatment, on-site treatment. Or it's just simply the protection of human health by any means of the environment or of any environmental value from the contamination. So it means that remediation doesn't just mean removing asbestos from the site. And sections 6.3 and 6.4 of the DOH guideline deal with some of these other processes that can be regarded as remediation. So things like restricting public access to the site, implementing a site management plan, or in some cases, containing asbestos on site. So building a purpose-built cell to contain the asbestos impacts rather than taking everything to landfill. Last of all, I just wanted to highlight this piece out of Chapter 7 of the DOH guideline, which makes some points about auditing and reporting. And it says that where asbestos is not the only contaminant, any reporting relating to asbestos should be clearly identified. And the reason for that is, I think you will all be aware, the Department of Health provides the technical expertise in relation to asbestos assessment, remediation and validation. So when our department receives reports on contaminated sites that have a component of asbestos assessment in them, we refer those reports to the Department of Health. So it's very helpful for us, as particularly if we're receiving information about a site that has loads and loads of issues, it's helpful if the asbestos reporting is either done separately or as a separate section of the report on the site. And that allows us to then ask the Department of Health just to focus on this aspect of the reporting. So it's really helpful for us if consultants can be aware of that when they write reports and facilitate that process for us, rather than us having to pick out, or Department of Health having to pick out different pieces of information from a very large report. That's all I had for you today. I'm happy to take questions.
Questions from the room first? Silence. Any
That's fine.
potential questions coming in? Potential question. I'm not sure we want to ask that one. No, that's fine.
Clear and concise. Clear and concise.
Clear and concise, perfect.
Great.
All right. I think we can move on then if there aren't any questions. If any turn up